Hello, this is going to be the lecture for section 1 of chapter 38. So I'm going to go ahead and start the chapter off. The way I recommend that you do this is maybe reading the chapter little by little and having me kind of explain. So whenever you click on a slide, read the section and then go ahead and play the narration. And you could just skip to the next slide. If there's something you understood pretty well, and just skip that slide and go to the ones you don't understand if that helps. Okay, this is just to help make sense of the chapter, and hopefully this is beneficial to you. Let's get started. Starting with an overview of the chapter and what chapter 38 is about. We're looking at the Cold War, and so after the Second World War, and actually towards the end of the war, it becomes clear that the United States and the Soviet Union, who were allies during the war, now have different visions for what the world's going to look like after the war. And so a rift between the US and the Soviet Union begins to emerge, and it revolves around their economic systems and their government ideologies. The Soviet Union being communist with a command economy, the United States being capitalist with a more democratic form of government. And so this competition to implement their economic and political systems for their own benefit ends up shaping the relation and the foreign policies of these two countries and really impacts a lot of the other world. Foreign policies, economic systems, and political systems are all shaped by this. So, what happens in Latin America, what happens in Southeast Asia, in China, in India is often shaped by this tension between the US and the Soviets. And so it's called the Cold War because it wasn't actually a belligerent war. It represents an international realignment of power into two superpowers. As opposed to before the wars where you had maybe 5, 6 European powers, now we see really two dominant powers competing for hegemony. And this geopolitical rivalry is going to last 5 decades, and it's going to be responsible for the military alliances that develop, as well as the government of certain countries that are aligned either to the US or the Soviets, that are called their client states. Um, in addition, we're going to see an unprecedented arms race. This buildup of weapons, as the two sides compete for military superiority, they engage in this really big military buildup. Um, in addition, armed conflicts and diplomatic crises emerged throughout the second half of the 20th century, and it brings the world pretty close to nuclear war at some points, especially in the 1960s. So this era deeply shapes the societies in the United States and the Soviet Union as democracy and capitalism and communism are all brought into question. So that's going to be the overview of this chapter. And even chapter 39 is going to kind of play into the relationship with the US and the Soviets. So when we get to chapter 39, it's also going to be influenced by this geopolitical rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. Section 1 is going to focus on how this developed, on the causes of the Cold War. And so this section is titled The Formation of the Bipolar World. And bipolar means two poles, two opposite sides. And it really has to do with the US and the Soviets being very opposite in a lot of different aspects. So let's take a look at those. What it all boils down to is economics. Every country always acts in their own interest. Every country is going to make decisions that are going to benefit them. And usually there's going to be some mutual benefit when countries negotiate. But because of the two very competing economic systems of capitalism and the command economy of communism, it really goes down to a competition of resources. If your country is going to develop a communist command economy, it is not going to function by the same rules of the profit motive that capitalism functions under. Therefore, capitalist countries are not going to be able to access the resource of communist countries because they're not operating on this system of supply and demand and a market economy. So, this economic competition is going to shape how the United States and the Soviet Union try to influence other countries around the world and the non aligned countries. So, that tension is known as the Cold War. And the reason why two superpowers emerged is after World War II, these were the only two countries remaining with enough industrial capacity to keep producing. The rest of European societies and Japan saw their economies devastated by the war. But since the US was separate on a different continent and the Soviets had moved their industry, remember, east of the Ural Mountains, we talked about that with World War II. At the end of the war, these were the two countries that were left in a position to produce what the world needed, but also to develop the weapons uh, moving forward. So let's take a look at these two competing ideologies, right? We've talked about it throughout the course, but like I've said before, throughout this year, that these are difficult concepts to grasp these economic systems. So we're going to look at capitalism on one side here. So the United States and its Western European allies operate on a system of capitalism. And capitalism is based off of having a free market where people make the decisions freely without government telling them what they can choose to produce or to buy. And it's based on private ownership of the means of production. People who want to invest in business can invest in business. People who want to open up a business and risk their life savings to start a business can do so. There's freedom to operate, and businesses are owned privately. Corporations are owned either by the individual owner or by a corporation made up of millions of private owners. What sets this economy in motion are the forces of supply and demand. If the people want more than is being supplied, the price goes up. If there's a lot of supply, there's a lot of product, but people aren't buying it, the price goes down. There's no interference by government. The market determines the prices. And you can see this recently when there's a big demand for things like toilet paper or bottled water, and there's not enough of it in the stores, people are going to pay higher prices. And there's no rule stopping them. Another aspect of capitalism is competition, the profit motive, right? The idea that you're trying to make money, so you're going to be motivated by making a profit. Now, I've talked about this before. The concept of greed is good because it leads to people making better products. Compare that to the Soviet Union and the system of communism over here, where the state owns the factors of production. So there's no competition because the government is in central control of the economy. It doesn't need to compete with anyone. So there's no need to change prices or to give into the aspects of supply and demand. The government determines what's going to be made, and that's called a command economy. The government distributes and decides who gets what, and it could be based on the type of job you have, based on your need, or sometimes just based on corruption and political favors. The goal of capitalism is to increase your wealth, and the idea is that if rich people get rich, they're going to pass some of that wealth down to consumers and to their workers, and the country is going to benefit as a whole by having more income tax being generated. The goal of communism, though, is to create social equality where everyone has the same, or there is no homelessness, for example. So they have different goals, and one really is if you work hard, if you do the right things, if you are in the right place at the right time, you can increase your wealth. Where the goal of communism is, well, everyone should have the basic necessities met. There should be some sort of social equality, so everybody's job matters. And that serves to demotivate people who normally would be trying to get rich because they're not going to want to work harder. So there's going to be some flaws to both. The flaws of capitalism is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And when the rich are controlling a lot of the wealth, they exploit the poor. They take advantage of the fact that you need their job for your own income. So they're going to pay you what they want to pay you, for example. And so there's an uneven distribution of goods and services. You have people who live paycheck to paycheck and other people who are billionaires and could spend money buying boats and private jets and never have to worry about money. In times of economic crisis, they don't worry because they're still going to be rich, whereas people that are poor, if they lose their job, they lose their paycheck. So those are some of the flaws of capitalism. In communism, some of the flaws are there's less motivation. If I'm not going to get richer than the next guy, why am I going to work harder? There also aren't any choices. The government determines who's going to make what. As a result of not having competition, you also end up with inferior consumer products because there's no desire to try to improve them because you're not trying to outsell anybody. It's controlled by the government. So corruption runs rampant and it enriches the people who are well connected. And the fact that there's not enough for everyone that wants, it also leads to the development of black markets, these underground markets where people who want more but aren't allowed to get it will seek the extra products. The pros of that, though, are that everyone has their basic needs met. So, ideally, there's no homelessness, there's no poverty, or at least there's no extreme poverty. The pros of capitalism is that there's freedom of choice. People have the ability to choose what they want to do, and there's upward mobility. You could start at the bottom and work your way up top. So, as you can see, these are two very different systems, and so they're not going to be compatible in the world when it comes to competing over resources. Why? Because let's say I have a mineral that is needed to make cell phones. If I am communist, I am trying to create social equality. I'm going to choose to sell my product to communist countries or work with them or trade with them. And that means the capitalist countries don't have access to my minerals. However, if my goal is to get rich, I'm going to sell it to a capitalist nation. And I might sell it to get rich, even though the people in my country might be very, very poor, because I don't really care what they live like. I care that I have some money. So that's going to be where these two countries are going to be trying to compete throughout the world to gain allies on their side. And these are just a couple of images you could see kind of capitalism and communism from the Cold War in action as you look at the pictures over here on the left, right, of a very well-stocked supermarket where you can go into a supermarket and see tons of the same product, different brands, well-stocked, and really like I'm going to buy this piece of bread here and I'm going to buy maybe one of these products that are over here. I'm never going to buy all this. But psychologically, I like to see it well stocked because it makes me feel like I have choice. Um, you could look at the images over here on the right, and these were from Soviet era grocery stores. Notice there's not a lot of product. Everything looks the same because the goal is everyone has their basic needs, right? You're going to get one type of ketchup or one type of bread. There's no competition between brands because it's produced by the government. The downfall is there may not always be enough, so you could see these lines of people outside waiting for a chance to buy their basic needs. Um, in a communist economy, the government would determine what you get. So in cases like this where there's not enough, the government sets a limit to what you can buy. Whereas in a capitalist economy, like you see over here on the left, people buy what they want. So those are kind of two images showing the different economic systems in the daily lives of people during the Cold War. To get to the origins of the Cold War, um, you can go all the way back to World War I in 1917, the Russian Revolution, when the Soviet Union became communist and became emerged in a civil war. The United States and Britain and its allies were fighting against Lenin's Red Army. So those are the kind of roots of tension. But really, we want to look at what happens in World War II. The Soviet Union formed a very unlikely alliance with the United States and Great Britain. These systems were already at odds before the war. They had one thing in common. They were both at war with Hitler and with Nazi Germany. So they formed this unlikely alliance. But the Soviet Union and Stalin resented the delays that the United States and the British put up in invading Europe. Russia, throughout 1942, 1943, was being devastated by the Germans. They were fighting, the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943 destroys the city of Stalingrad 98%. And Stalin kept asking the Allies to open up another front to invade Europe. Remember, at this time, Europe was under Nazi control. So in order to free the Europeans from Nazi control, they had to invade Europe. That was the Normandy invasion. And Stalin had been asking for this invasion so that it would split the German army up into two fronts. But they kept putting delays. So Stalin resented that and felt that the Soviet Union lost millions and millions of soldiers when it didn't have to, because the D-Day invasion does not get launched until 1944. So that cost the Soviet Union millions of lives in fighting the Germans on one front. The United States and Britain resented Stalin for having a pact with Hitler. For when they formed the Non-Aggression Pact and Hitler invaded Poland, the Soviet Union took the other half of Poland and invaded Finland. So there was resentment on that end as well. So already the tensions were running high during the war. They were allies because they had a common enemy, but in reality, the alliance was very shaky from the beginning. During the war itself, towards the end of the war, um, more tensions begin to arise at the post-war meetings. At the Yalta Conference between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, and at the Potsdam Conference, Stalin, Churchill, and this time Harry Truman, because President Roosevelt died while in office in his last term. So Harry Truman became the president at the end of the war. At these conferences, they met to discuss several things, such as, declaring war on Japan. The Soviet Union was not at war with Japan yet, but they were also agreeing on what to do with Europe after the Nazis were defeated. And the agreement was that each power will occupy and control areas that they liberate. So if American forces liberate a city or a town or a country from Nazi control, then the US will get to decide and control that area after the war. If the Soviet Union liberates it, it gets that right. So at these conferences, Stalin agrees to make war on Japan and join the war to help defeat Japan. And Stalin makes it clear that he wants control of Eastern Europe and Poland. Stalin does not trust the West. He doesn't trust capitalist nations. He feels that this war that Germany launched was an attack on communism, and he fears that the Western allies will also want to see communism destroyed. So he wants to create a buffer zone. He wants the countries on its borders, the Eastern European countries, to protect it from another invasion. So there's an agreement that the areas in Eastern Europe that get liberated by the Soviet army will be under the influence of Stalin. They asked Stalin for him to have free elections, but they really knew the elections were not going to be free, and they weren't going to hold Stalin to them. They also agree to partition Germany into zones of occupation. And so the map that you see here shows Germany and how it was divided. So all of this here is Germany. And since the Soviet army was coming from the east and the US and the British armies were coming from the west, there's this race at the end of the war to get to Berlin. Now, Berlin is going to be in the eastern part of Germany. But since the United States and the British liberated the western part, they partitioned it. And after the war, the French occupied a zone, the British occupied a zone, the Americans occupied a zone of West Germany. The Soviet Union, since it liberated Germany from the east over here, it got to then take control and occupy East Germany. And actually what you see here, and I was wrong right now, I said it was a map of Germany. It's a map of Berlin, but Germany follows the same pattern, right? The eastern part of Germany was under Soviet control. But they also divided the capital city of Berlin. And so this map is of Berlin. Sorry for the confusion earlier. Germany's much bigger. But it's the same kind of concept. Now, Berlin is located inside of the Soviet Union's area of Germany. So it is in East Germany. So all this area surrounding Berlin is communist control. But the city itself has Western occupied portions of the city. So this becomes kind of the ground zero to the Cold War. This is where the US and the Soviets are right next to each other in the same city with different forms of governing within a city. And the rest of the country followed the same pattern. And so immediately after the war, you begin to see this schism take place in Europe. The Soviets, like I said right now, they took East Germany, and the Allies took West Germany. So you can see from this map here is East Germany, right? And the West was here. And like I said earlier, the city of Berlin, which is inside of this area, was also divided into four. Since the Soviet Union liberated Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria during the war, it freed them from the Nazis. As it was liberating them, it was putting in place communist governments. It was implementing supposedly free elections in which communists always won, and now those governments were loyal to Stalin and the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia, here, it actually liberated itself. The Yugoslavian people drove the Nazis out themselves, and they became communists, but since they were not liberated by the Soviet Union, they do not end up in an alliance, and they do not end up pledging loyalty to the Soviet Union. So during this period, Yugoslavia is a communist country, but it is not considered a satellite or a nation controlled by the Soviet Union because they freed themselves. Meanwhile, the Western European countries end up becoming more democratic. And so Winston Churchill, in a speech, spoke about this division between the communist and the non-communist Europeans, this little division here, as an iron curtain. He says, an iron curtain has fallen. And the term iron curtain refers to this division between two very different political systems. There was no physical iron wall that was built. But we begin to see the Cold War emerge after the Second World War by having the world divided between the communist and non-communist countries. Korea also gets divided at the 38th parallel, and we'll talk a little bit about Korea later. But we see these post-war territorial divisions being shaped along the lines of communism, non-communism. And if you take a look at this cartoon, you can kind of see, right, the analogy. You could see the hammer and the sickle of the Soviet Union here on the pipe. And you could see Stalin here, right, choking on the smoke because this pipe has been clogged with Truman's doctrine, right? So if you kind of analyze that cartoon, it's trying to say that the Truman Doctrine was trying to choke Stalin, essentially. So the Truman Doctrine was a policy set forth in 1947 by US President Harry Truman. And in a speech, Harry Truman pledges to support, quote, free people resisting subjugation. What he was trying to say is that the United States will help people who are fighting against communism, countries that are trying to become communist or countries where the communist leaders are trying to implement more control. The United States will help out. So the world is perceived to be divided between free and non-free, or free and communist countries. So this becomes known as the policy of containment. And it shifted the United States' foreign policy from one of isolationism before World War II. Remember, the United States was like, we're not going to get involved in your business, to now interventionism, which is completely opposite. We're going to get all up in your business. We're going to intervene if we see communism spreading to your country. So the Truman Doctrine outlines the US policy known as containment. We will contain the spread of communism, right? Keep it from spreading. It doesn't mean that the United States was going to go and undo communism where it existed. It meant that the United States was not going to allow it to spread beyond the countries it had already spread to. And Turkey and Greece are the first countries to be aided by this, as the United States sends weapons and money to help fight against the growth of communism in Turkey and Greece. Another form of, fighting the Cold War or getting countries on the side of the US was by having the Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State George C. Marshall in 1948. And this was a economic recovery program for European countries that were trying to recover from World War II. The goal of the Marshall Plan was to rebuild Europe. And the idea is that if Europe is more stable because the war had destabilized it, if Europe becomes stable, then it is going to see its economy grow, it's going to see its wealth grow, and if it's wealthy the way it was before the war, it is not going to want to turn to communism. Remember, communism is a system that is supported when the majority of the people in a country live at a poor level. But when the majority of the country are either well off or middle class, they are not going to want to turn to communism. So this program was designed to strengthen capitalism in Europe. And the recipients, if you wanted money from the Marshall Plan, you had to purchase American made goods. So this was a way of the United States gaining economic allies. And so the countries of Western Europe took advantage of the US loans to help it recover from the war. And in return, the US becomes an ally of those nations. The Eastern European countries, however, even though they were offered the money, were not allowed to accept it because the Soviet Union would not allow them to borrow money from the United States. And instead, the Soviet Union implemented its own economic program for the Eastern European countries. And so the economic program of the Soviet Union was called Comecon, not like the comic book convention, but this was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And that was their response to the Marshall Plan, so that these countries of Eastern Europe would not turn to the United States. And so it applied to the Eastern European countries, which we'll call Soviet satellite nations. And the reason we call them satellite nations, okay, is because a satellite is something you control from a distance. And these countries were being controlled by Moscow. So even though they were independent technically, like Hungary or Bulgaria, in reality, those governments were under the control of Moscow, of the Soviet Union. And so they were not allowed to take advantage of the Marshall Plan, but the Soviet Union provided their own economic recovery program. Another move that escalates the tension of the Cold War early on is the formation of NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this is the Atlantic Ocean, and obviously this is the northern half of the globe. And so countries on the North Atlantic, which include the United States, Canada, and Iceland, United Kingdom, Norway, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, etc., right? Those countries form a mutual defense alliance. And so this is a regional military alliance against Soviet aggression. So this makes it clear that if the Soviet Union were to try to spread communism and it were to try to invade one of these countries, then they would all come to each other's defense. And so the idea here is to let the Soviet Union know that we have allies. Don't mess with any of us because we're all in this together. And so that's going to escalate tensions because now if you're the Soviet Union, you're going to feel threatened that all of these countries are forming a military alliance. To respond to this alliance in 1955, the Soviet Union creates its own alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. And you can see the flags of the nations of the Warsaw Pact. And that was the Soviet Union's response to NATO. So now they are also in an alliance. So what we're seeing now is a bipolar world. We're seeing the world, especially the Northern Hemisphere, become divided between these two big rival alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And the goal of both superpowers is to protect the hegemony within the alliance, to make sure that they are in control of those countries. Not all of the post-war developments were negative. One example of cooperation that was seen is when the Soviets and the US, right after the war, cooperated to maintain an international peace by creating the United Nations. And so the United Nations was the League of Nations Part 2. This was a second attempt. Remember, the League of Nations didn't work. So now what they did was they included a Security Council. So they included the ability for the United Nations to actually send troops into conflict. And they created a Security Council with five permanent members. The US and the Soviet Union, which now is just Russia, are part of the permanent countries of the Security Council. So the goal of the United Nations was to maintain international peace and security and also help with international development. This is an organization that is still around. It is not perfect, but it has done a lot to keep the world from plunging into another major global war. So ground zero for the war was in Europe, since it was in Europe where the Soviet Union and its immediate allies were right next door to the allies of the United States. And this tension is going to shape Europe from 1945 through 1990. And again, this is what Winston Churchill calls an Iron Curtain, because for this time, it is very difficult for people to travel from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, from a country that is in the communist bloc to a country that is not, into one of the NATO states. It's going to become difficult for people to travel. And then in Germany, remember, Germany gets split into East and West Germany. We now have two countries. The German Democratic Republic, which is actually the name of the communist part, even though it wasn't democratic, and the German Federated Republic, which was West Germany. And there you have families that, had lived in Germany. There were German families in different parts of Germany who now were split apart. And so you have people who lost family and did not see families for decades because of this quote unquote Iron Curtain. And if Europe was, the center of the Cold War, ground zero was going to be in Berlin. Because, like I said earlier, that's where the United States and the Soviet Union are occupying the same city. So here you could get a better view. Here is Germany. This time I am correct. Right here is Germany. And this blue, or whatever the color of this light blue, is the communist Germany. That's East Germany. And deep within is the city of Berlin, which is now kind of amplified here. And you may have heard of the Berlin Wall. We'll get to talk to that a little bit in a little bit. And so you could see that Germany, West Germany, was occupied by the British, the French, and the Americans. And then eventually, the British, the French, and the Americans decide to combine their three segments of Germany and create West Germany. And they do this, and they change the currency of Germany without telling Stalin. And that's going to create tensions. And Stalin is going to try to drive the Western European countries out of Berlin. He's going to begin to claim that the city is in his sector, therefore he doesn't have to have them there. And so we're going to see the first test of the Cold War take place in Berlin. And the reason, again, this is called a Cold War is because it never becomes a hot war. It never becomes belligerent. It never gets to the point where the United States and the Soviet Union are actually at war with each other. Instead, they are involved in a conflict and a series of tensions, and they're kind of what they call saber rattling. They're both flexing their muscle trying to get their way. And there are going to be places where there will be war, but they'll never fight directly. There will be wars where the United States will aid one side and the Soviets will aid another, and those are called proxy wars, and we'll look at that in one of the later sections. Earlier I was mentioning the unification of West Germany angered Stalin because they changed the currency without letting him know or without getting his approval. So Stalin decides to kick Britain, France, and the United States out of Berlin since it was in his sector. And you can see from the cartoon here, right? Remember we talked about the bear before? That is Russia. And the bear is encircling Berlin, And inside of Berlin, we see the British, the American, and the French sectors, right? And he's trying to lock them out. So he blocks all the roads to Berlin so that the American, British, and French sectors cannot get supplies from the West. He also closes the airports. And the idea was if these countries feel they are locked out, then they'll abandon their claim to Berlin and they will leave Berlin, which was the capital and the most important industrial producing center of Germany. This is the first big event of the Cold War, and it was known as the Berlin Airlift. The Allies respond by daily airlifting supplies. Since all the roads were closed and the airports were closed, it began to fly airplanes overhead and drop supplies off of these planes to supply the people of West Berlin. And every day, every hour, there were flights coming in and dropping off supplies. And this went on for months until Stalin eventually kind of gave up and said, okay, he's not gonna stop this. They're gonna keep dropping supplies, and he's not gonna risk a war, going to war over Berlin. So he decides, okay, he throws his hands up. You guys can keep this half of Berlin. So West Berlin remained capitalist and under the control of, the Western style government of Germany, more democratic. People had more freedoms, and they had a different currency. By 1961, as the world recovered from the war, West Germany was doing much better than East Germany. And the wealth and the opportunities and how far your dollar goes in West Germany was much better than in East Germany, and that was seen in Berlin. So in West Berlin, there was a different currency, different job opportunities, more wealth than in East Berlin. And so you could think about it as, imagine if there were no border between San Diego and Tijuana, right? The jobs pay better in the United States. The living conditions are better in most parts than they are in Tijuana. And if there were no border, no physical barrier, a lot more people would come work and live in San Diego. And that's what was happening in Berlin. People were leaving East Berlin to go to West Berlin, and they were doing it to go live in West Germany. And you could see from this picture right in the center, this was the only border. These were checkpoints, and this one, was known as Checkpoint Charlie because of the letter C. All you do is go from one side to the other, and you are leaving the American sector, like you see that sign, and you're entering into the Soviet sector, right? That was the border, just crossing one side of that checkpoint to another. Of course, you see these tanks right there, so it was a very tense city to be living in. Well, what people were doing is they were going to Berlin from other parts of East Germany, and they were then crossing to West Berlin, where they would fly to West Germany and escape the communist government. So East Berlin kind of became this gap where people could flee the communist rule of East Germany. And the East German government in 1961 did not want that. If people are leaving your country in mass, it's making it look like your country's a failure, and you don't want your country to be drained of its wealth or of its workers, especially high-skilled workers that you need. And so in 1961, the communist government of East Germany began to construct the Berlin Wall. So here you see pictures of a wall being built, right? And then just right across the city. And there you see right in front of this is a famous Brandenburg Gate. Right in front of the gate, we see the wall being built. And over here, this is East Berlin on this side. And this is West Berlin. And unlike the border, which the US built to keep people from coming in, this was a border or a barrier that was built to keep people in East Germany, to keep people in East Berlin. So they built a wall around West Berlin so no one would enter West Berlin because they didn't want people leaving the country. And these are just a couple of images of Berlin today that I took when today the city is reunited. It's been reunited since 1989. In 1989, Germany unified and they tore down the Berlin Wall. You could see though through the style, through the style of buildings and architectures that you see here. This was a much wealthier part of Berlin. When you go to East Berlin, you could see very square, very basic style of buildings, which were very typical of the communist era. In addition, you can see, these are the two different types of automobiles. These two sides of Berlin and of Germany were not trading with each other. They did not have the same products. They didn't have any of the same products because this car, I think it was a Trebuchet, I think it's called, was designed for a communist economy. It was meant to be a car everyone could afford, and it was used in a communist system. So it's not going to have as much little bells and whistles as the Volkswagen that was being used in West Germany. And you could see this throughout. You could see this in the jeans they wore. You could see this in the television sets they had, in the kitchen appliances. Very different products and often not compatible because they were being designed very differently by different engineers. Another interesting image is this is a museum that is today in um, in East Berlin. It's called the DDR Museum, and it's a museum that shows the way life was different within one city on one side of the city versus the other. And in there's a little foosball game, and you could see that their foosball was pinning the East Germans against the West Germans, right? So there was this tension over who's better. And then this is a place that's still around today, one of the places where the Berlin Wall is still around. You could see this gap in the wall right there. This is known as the East Side Gallery. And all along this side, you see graffiti, and people are free to go and tag the wall and write whatever they want. On the other side of the wall are actually a bunch of murals that represent freedom and unity and memorials to people who died trying to cross this wall. So this is a very cool place. And so this is about a mile stretch of, I think, of the Berlin Wall that's still intact. But throughout most of the city, all you see are little plaques on the floor showing you where the wall used to run. Now, by the 1950s, so all these events in Germany and in Berlin are taking place in the 1940s. And in 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests an atomic bomb. And by 1949, the United States is no longer alone as the only country with a atomic bomb. This sets up a competition and a fear that if the Soviet Unions have a bomb like we do, they may use it against us. So we have to build bigger bombs and more bombs. And the Soviet Union responds by doing the same thing. And so you could see from the cartoon up top, right? It has these bombs, H, Z, Y, and there's a little thing that says, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. And on their side, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. So you see these soldiers are fighting each other with bows and arrows. And even though they both have these massive weapons, these weapons of mass destruction, they're fighting with bows and arrows. And that's kind of to show that the reason why the US and the Soviet Union began to build up their arsenals was not to go to war, but it was called deterrence. The idea that if I have more than you, you're not going to attack me. If you get more than I do, I'm going to be afraid of you, so I need to build more than you. And you can see from the graph here then how that competition led, to the US at its peak to develop over 31,000 nuclear weapons. And at the peak, the Soviet Union had a little over 40,000 nuclear weapons. So we're looking at combined at 1.70,000 weapons of mass destruction. That's enough to blow up the planet 13 times. Okay, once is enough, right? Once will do it, but 13, times. And again, these were not meant to be used. And it kind of shows the ridiculousness of how much money is invested into weapons that are going to destroy humanity, all for the purpose of not using them. And the closest the world got to using them was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this cartoon here shows how John F. Kennedy is sitting on a Soviet bomb, and Nikita Khrushchev has his finger on the button to that bomb, and he's sitting on an American bomb that John F. Kennedy has his hand on a button. And this was an event where we'll talk about that later, but this was an event where we were within an hour away of launching a war that could have destroyed both countries. And thankfully, it didn't occur. Cooler heads prevailed, and I'll get to that a little later. Eventually, when these weapons become so massive in number, the countries decide, you know what, we need to start getting rid of them and stop testing them, and they started forming treaties. And you can see this decline that takes place in the 1980s and even into the 2000s. We still have a lot. And they're still dangerous because even though there's no Cold War right now, these weapons are still in existence. And in the last few years, we've seen increasing tensions between the US and the Russians, especially the moves by Vladimir Putin to try to influence our elections. He is now convincing the Russian government to give him more power, so he has the potential to become, a person who will be in firm control of Russia, and he has access to these weapons. And then So the Cold War begins to take a different turn in Asia as we begin to see the rise of proxy wars. Those are wars that we are fighting not directly, but through different conflicts. In Korea, we see the division of the peninsula along the 38th parallel line. So if Korea is a peninsula like I'm drawing here, and lines on the map are called parallels, right? They go like that. On the 38th line, the 38th degree, they divided North Korea and South Korea. And here you see this picture of the 38th parallel. You are now crossing the 38th parallel. South Korea was influenced by the United States, and North Korea was influenced by the Soviet Union. When the leader of North Korea, who was communist because he was, being put in place by the Soviets and supported by the Soviets, also by the time of the Korean War, we also see China has become communist. They decide to try to unite the entire Korea Peninsula. They don't want it divided. They feel this division was done by Europeans, not by the Korean people themselves. They launch an attack on South Korea, and the United States sends aid to the South Korean government. And it sends troops. So the United States in the 1950s, we get involved in the Korean War on the side of South Korea, and North Korea turns to the Russians and to the Chinese for allies and for weapons. And we drive the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel and then further into North Korea until there's a stalemate, and North Korea and South Korea and the United States and their allies sit down and they create a line of demarcation, and they create what is called a DMZ, a demilitarized zone between the two countries, which they're not going to fight. They're going to have this zone in between where they're not going to have any troops, and they're going to stop fighting until they can negotiate a peace treaty. And so that ceasefire takes place in the 1950s, and to this day, there has not been a treaty officially ending the Korean War. And the North Korean government today still wants to take over the South Korean country. So a lot of the tensions with North Korea today still exist. And more so now that North Korea is testing nuclear weapons. And, they may want to use those nuclear weapons to force South Korea to surrender. Now, another event we see is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the United States begins to discover through spy photography, spy planes that we've flown over, that Cuba is building nuclear missile silos. They're building bases to house nuclear weapons, and they're being built by the Russians. The Russians are sending supplies and weapons to Cuba. And that's going to give Russians very close access because Cuba's only 75 miles off the coast of the United States. Russia feels that it wants to be close enough to strike the US in a nuclear attack because the United States has nuclear missile bases in Turkey, which are very close to Russia. So it feels that it wants to also have that ability to strike the United States quickly should a war comes. And since Cuba in 1959 had become communist with the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro first turns to the US for economic aid, but the United States doesn't want to because it's communist, so he turns to the Soviet Union. And so there's where the Soviet Union kind of gets its foot into the American continent by having an ally in Cuba. And it uses that to begin to build these bases. So again, Korea was divided after World War II. During World War II, it was occupied by Japan. And since the Soviets had helped liberate it, they had a say in what happened, right? And so the US and the Soviets could not agree on how to reunite the country, so they divided it. And in the South, the Republic of Korea made Seoul its capital, and it had a very conservative and anti-communist leader named Syngman Rhee, and that was their president. In the North, you have the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, with Pyongyang as its capital and Kim Il-sung as its leader. Kim Il-sung is the grandfather of the current North Korean dictator. And so that's the 38th parallel that you see demarcating the two, the North and the South, right? So in 1950, okay, Pyongyang, the government of Kim Il-sung, decides it's going to reunite Korea by force, and that's when it launches the invasion. But the South Koreans defended, and they were able to defend and get the help of the United States, and eventually they began to drive them back. The United States uses the United Nations to support South Korea and to be able to use ground forces. So this was actually an international force that was involved. And then China also gets involved. They issue a warning for the United States not to cross the 38th parallel because that would threaten the Chinese interest, and that would force the Chinese to get involved. And so this went on from 1950 to about 1953. And then that's when in July they finally agreed to cease fire. But they've never seen a unification take place. So that's what I was talking about earlier. That's still there. What the Korean War does is this now shows the policy of containment going global. This shows that the United States will get involved militarily to stop the spread of communism, not just by sending weapons, but actually by sending troops and by getting involved in the war. So now we see the globalization of the American policy of containment, and that takes place in North Korea. And eventually you begin to see the creation of a security organization called SEATO, or SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And that's basically Southeast Asia's version of NATO. And that's where the US begins to use its military troops to keep countries in Asia from becoming communist. And we'll see that later again. We'll see another war with the Vietnam War later. So here you see these images. You can see from this one, the stamp, right? The part of the map that's highlighted is Southeast Asia. And the goal again of containment was to stop the spread of communism. And here you see Southeast Asia again. And you could see, the encroachment of communism where the US is trying to stop communism. And so the goal of CETA was to help these countries form an alliance to stop communism from growing in the region. So by now, the Soviet Union was communist, Cuba was communist, China was communist, and North Korea was communist. So the goal is to keep it from spreading any further. So another flashpoint that I talked about earlier was in Cuba. And in 1959, Fidel Castro led a Cuban revolution. And you might recognize Che Guevara. He's, an icon on a lot of t-shirts and posters and a symbol of rebellion all over the world today. They started a revolution against the dictator Fulgencio Batista. They were they created a communist government. They felt that the government of Fulgencio Batista was only serving the interests of the United States. Cuba was essentially a island nation where Americans would go gamble. Americans with money would go gamble. They would go to the beautiful beaches. But the Cuban people were not even allowed to go on the beaches because they didn't want them on the beach with the tourists. They wanted, the tourists to be able to experience the luxury of the island, but the people were working in very poor conditions. A lot of the women, the only opportunity for women was prostitution, and it was a dictatorship that Castro wanted to overthrow. And in 1959, they do. And this this new regime is telling the United States, we're not going to be subservient to you. But they still are trying to create an equal relationship. They want to create an equal relationship with the US, but the US does not want that. And the United States wants to maintain control. In 1961, the United States tries to launch an invasion, the Bay of Pigs, because that's the name of the bay where they invaded. So the CIA trained 1,500 anti-Castro Cubans, people who had left Cuba during the revolution, often people that came from wealth, because the people who had money, they fled Cuba. They went to Miami and other parts of the U.S., and they put a lot of pressure on the U.S. to kind of put them back in power. So the CIA trains these anti-Castro fighters, they arm them, and then they transport them to the Bay of Pigs to invade and overthrow Castro, but this invasion fails, and they are eventually arrested. Eventually, Fidel Castro will have them released to the U.S. in return for promises not to invade and for medical supplies for his people. So they will eventually be released back to the United States. But this failed invasion was, one, it was an embarrassment for the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, but it also led Fidel Castro to distrust the United States because it felt the United States was trying to overthrow him. So Fidel Castro then turned to the Soviet Union for help. And in return for help, it allowed the Soviet Union to build missile bases. And you could see the map that is located here, right, showing how far away different locations are within the range of nuclear missiles. So in 1963, the United States finds out that the Soviet Union is installing bases. And it enters into a negotiation with the Russians. Here you see John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, and Nikita Khrushchev, which was now the new leader, the premier of the Soviet Union, negotiating. And I showed you the cartoon earlier of this tense exchange. There, the United States is saying, back down. It has ships that are right alongside with the Russian ships that are on their way with nuclear missiles. And it's telling the Russians, turn the ships around. If you activate these missile bases, we will go to war. And so it becomes a game of chicken where Nikita Khrushchev doesn't know if John F. Kennedy is really going to go through and attack Russia. And so for 13 days in October of 1963, and by the way, if you want to watch a movie over the break, 13 Days is about this event. That's the name of the movie. So for 13 days in October, it's a very tense situation where the U.S. and the Russians are not backing down, and the ships are getting closer to Cuba. Um, Global tension is very high, and no country wants to lose face. And what actually happens, and the reason why war is avoided, is because John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev both don't want to do this. They both know that a nuclear war will be disastrous for both, and they establish a red line. They establish a line of communication, which is like what today now email is, or instant messenger, between the Kremlin, which is the Soviet capital, and the White House. So they have a direct line of communication because their representatives, through their representatives, no representative wants to back down and they want to save face. So the representatives are not really trying to stop this. So they both kind of negotiate in secrecy with each other. They both write to each other very calmly, and they're saying, "Look, we need to, deal with this." So they eventually come to an agreement, and the agreement was that the Soviet Union will remove its missile bases from Cuba. The United States will promise not to try to invade Cuba and promise not to try to take out Fidel Castro. And it also secretly promised they would not announce it publicly, but secretly they promised it would remove its missiles that the U.S. had placed in Turkey to ease the Soviet Union's concern. And had that not happened, then the world would have gone to nuclear war because at the time they didn't know the impact these weapons would have. And now that we look back at this event, we're glad it didn't happen because this would have been very disastrous, not just for these two countries, but for the planet as a whole. Now, moving away from international politics and now looking at domestic societies, this last part of the section one is going to look at the Cold War societies. And here you see a picture of both the African American civil rights movement and the kitchen debate that you read about. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the Cold War also shapes domestic developments. And after World War II, there was a lot going on in Western societies, especially in the United States, um, as we look at the role of women. And so domestic containment refers to trying to kind of shape the ideology in the United States to get people to support capitalism in the US. When the war was over, a lot of soldiers returned home, which means they needed a place to work. And what we see is then this push to try to get American women back at home and back into domesticity, but women were experiencing liberation. And there's a clash because in the Soviet Union, the idea that everyone is equal is pushing Soviet women, like you see pictured here, into research, into universities. They're becoming professionals, they're becoming scientists, they're becoming doctors. They are by no means equal. There are still patriarchal structures in Russia. However, the opportunities were much more than American women, where you see here a woman being, promoted as staying at home, taking care of babies and washing the clothes, doing the domestic chores. And that's what the great kitchen debate was about that you read about. And I showed you the picture where at the time, Vice President Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev were touring each other's countries' technological exhibits that they were working to try to not to cooperate, but to show that they could compete, not just militarily, but also technologically. And Nixon kind of shows this household with all these great appliances like washing machines and dishwashers and refrigerators and essentially all these things to make a woman's life easier at home. And that was kind of pushing this ideology that a woman's job, her domain is the household. Russian women saw themselves more as liberated because they had the same opportunities as men and they were being contributors in the field of research and science and technology. So those were some of the different views. So, and oftentimes female liberation and feminism here in the United States, a lot of early feminist writers were seen as communists because of the influence they were seeing in women in other countries. Concerns of the spread of communism at home also led to a period in the 1950s where communism just gets this really, really bad name. And this is where a lot, even today, if you follow the news and the elections, a lot of people call Bernie Sanders a communist, and they talk about socialism and communism. And this is why a lot of people in the United States just hear that term and automatically think the worst, because of the propaganda of the Cold War. If people who today are elderly, parents, even like me, I grew up at the end of the Cold War, so we grew up thinking communism is bad, without really questioning what communism and socialism and social democracy, what these different systems are like. We just hear socialism or communism and we just assume Russia. And that's where a lot of propaganda, even today, when they call Obama or Sanders communists, which they're really not at all. But that stems from this era. And in the 1950s, a senator, Joe McCarthy, begins to, fear that communist spies, because there had been some incidences, right? The Soviets got the atomic bomb because there was spies working on the Manhattan Project. He feels that, no one could be trusted, that the Russians are trying to spy on us. They're trying to destroy ourselves, our society. They're trying to turn our own people against us. And so it became a witch hunt when he wanted to expose anyone he thought might have ties to communism. So anybody who questioned the role of the United States, his military policies, anyone who didn't agree with certain policies, he would label a communist and he would have his lists of accused communists. And oftentimes, if you made it onto one of his lists, your career was pretty much ruined. There was a lot of actors and directors in Hollywood who were blacklisted because they were on his list. People who had once been part of members of the Communist Party had their reputations, dragged through the mud. And, this era was known as McCarthyism or the Red Scare. And there had been other Red Scares in the 1920s before this. So this tension eventually led to him being censored in Congress because he started going too far, and anyone who disagreed with him, they'd get called communist. But this was one of the uglier chapters in our history where people lost the freedom of speech, their freedom of expression because of this fear of communism. And again, as mentioned earlier, right after the war, there's this push for domesticity. And TV shows like Leave It to Beaver with the wife, June Cleaver, right, portrayed this perfect mom who, gets up and does her hair and goes to bed, doesn't take off her makeup until after her husband's asleep, and wakes up before him and puts her makeup on, and then wakes up in the morning next to him. So he thinks that that's how she's looked all night, and cooks and has breakfast ready and lunch ready and dinner ready for everyone, and that's her job, and that's what a good mother is. So TV shows were kind of pushing this when that wasn't reality. Women were dissatisfied with having to leave the workplace. Women were enjoying their sense of independence and their sense of economic independence. So you begin to see the growth of feminism as U.S. women begin to reject these norms of domesticity. And so books like The Second Sex and the feminist mystique are some of the groundwork of the feminist movement, where calling for women's liberation and understanding the oppression, really challenging patriarchal views, um, looking at um, how women were basically unhappy being controlled and wanting to have equality, wanting to have control of their own bodies, control of reproduction, control of how they dress. So you begin to see the rise of feminism and the women's rights movement start. And these were two of the books that were very influential in that initial stage. Another social change happening was the rise of Black nationalism. And in chapter 39, you're going to read a little bit more about this as well. So after World War II, we also see the decolonization of Africa. We see these former colonies becoming independent nations, and leaders like Kwame Nkrumah being held at the same level as an American president, but also the ideas of people like Marcus Garvey that we'd seen before, and the music of Bob Marley, songs like Africa Unite, Get Up, Stand Up, calling for people of African descent to show unity. You begin to see this formation of an ideology with called Pan-Africanism, where people of African descent all over the planet begin to look at blackness as part of their ideology or their nationalism. So black nationalism in the United States looks at the people wanting to gain equal rights. In the United States, slavery was outlawed in 1863, but the Civil War doesn't end until 65. And after the Civil War, when black people were given the same rights, governments started to pass a series of Jim Crow laws. And so even though slavery was over, you still have for another 100 years laws that kept African Americans from going to the same schools, accessing the same opportunities, living in the same neighborhoods. They didn't have the same political rights. They didn't have the same rights in the court of laws. So racism was still very much alive. And soldiers who'd come back from the war began to also question, hey, we just fought this racist regime and only to come home to our own racist regime. This isn't right. So a combination of new consciousness from soldiers returning from war, plus what's happening in Africa with decolonization, begins to shape the desire for African Americans to start their own civil rights movement. And we begin to see this taking shape in the 1950s and then into the 1960s. So in the context of the Cold War, we could see how the Cold War is really shaping and helped shape the civil rights movement, because the Soviet Union was using propaganda like, saying, look, in the Soviet Union, we're all equal. Look at the American society. They're not equal. It's not they're not democratic. Black people don't have the right to vote. Black people don't have the same opportunities. So they look at the conditions of African Americans to expose the weakness of capitalism. And people within the United States are also looking at this. And so you also see people that were involved in the civil rights movement often being accused of being communist sympathizers, because they're looking at models of other countries where people are treated with equal rights. So you could see from these images, right? This is people in the 1960s not, stop race mixing, not wanting mixed race couples. Where other people, all they wanted was desegregation. They wanted to be able to go to the same schools and have the same opportunities as whites, and there was a lot of violent backlash. So think about like how this is not that long ago. Some of the people in these photographs are still alive today. And some people have the view, you could see, the women back here and how they're looking at, these are high school girls in the back, and how they're looking at a girl just for being black, desegregating schools. After the 1954 Brown versus Board case, schools are desegregated, and the African American students, just to go to school, have to be escorted by the military, by the National Guard, to protect their safety. That's crazy. Like, just to think, just because of the color of their skin, right? Now, if this is how people felt about them going to school with their children, you can imagine how they saw them hiring them at their job, how they're going to see them when they get pulled over. These are views that don't just disappear. They're still with us today. These views have been part of American society since slavery. And the civil rights movement was the beginning of more black liberation, but a lot of these feelings were just taken underground. But we still see people are not being treated the same. We still see the legacy of what it was like not to be able to have the same opportunities, not being able to buy in the homes in certain neighborhoods. We still see the legacy of segregation today. So the civil rights movement was the first and the foremost challenge to segregation, and you've seen key figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Uh, you could see the students of SNCC here confronting the police at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they were met with the Ku Klux Klan. This became a very violent confrontation. If you've ever seen the movie Selma, this is another movie if you want to watch over the break. I recommend the movie Selma, which is all about the organization that took place and um, and the events that take place at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So this was all part of an international movement for Black rights and Black celebrating Blackness and Black nationalism. Um, you could see this banner here where it talks about Nkrumahism, right? So throughout Africa, you also see Pan-Africanism growing, and oftentimes it was associated with socialism because people looked at socialism and the idea of distributing, if Black people had been segregated and not had the same opportunities, then they should have some wealth redistributed to their communities, right? People saw that as socialism. So they also attacked a lot of the civil rights leaders as communist and used anti-communist rhetoric to fight against the civil rights. That was something taking place here in the U.S. So while the U.S. did not do well in terms of how it treated ethnic minorities, um, what it did do better than the Soviet Union was create consumer products. And it's kind of sad when you think about this. When you look at our society today, how this kind of we see the root. Money is what mattered more than human rights. It was consumerism, buy, buy, buy. So these are some examples of American consumerism, right? McDonald's and just all the goods that you can have, all the toys you can have in your house. So this was one area where the US was doing better than the Soviet Union. Capitalism creates more products, right? Competition means I want a better burger, so I'm going to have In N Out. I'm going to have Burger King. I want a better television, so I'm going to have this company and that company. So capitalism lends itself to consumerism, where the Soviet Union was trying to focus a lot more on scientific endeavors and focus on scientific knowledge, mathematics. So it's no coincidence that they're going to see the first breakthroughs in space travel. And the US is going to see a big growth in consumer products. So it kind of shows you what the value of each society was at the time. So that Soviet focus on technology led them to develop the first breakthroughs in space, first by launching Sputnik, and then by putting the first man in space, which was Yuri Gagarin. He was a Soviet cosmonaut. So these events, first the launching of Sputnik really took the US by surprise, and that's when John F. Kennedy kind of redirected the focus of the US and began to heavily invest in education to be able to put a man on the moon, right? So the Soviets are the first to go into orbit, they're the first to launch a satellite, and then the United States becomes the first to place somebody on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in their mission, um, the Apollo missions to get to the moon. So this now leads to this what's called the space race, right? So again, the Soviet Union and the United States are competing on a technological level to develop space technology. And the idea is if you could develop space technology like satellites, then you're going to create the systems that are going to allow you to control, you know, these long distance intercontinental ballistic missiles and other military technology. Today, our military technology, our communications in general, the internet, everything really depends heavily on satellites and space technology. And finally, we get to the end of a very long section. This is the last slide. And this one looks at peaceful coexistence that takes place after the death of Stalin in 1953, by the way. another movie you can watch, The Death of Stalin. So after the death of Stalin in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union and begins to implement a policy called de-Stalinization, where the Soviet Union kind of comes clean on what Stalin did, on how he treated the country, on his crimes and the political prisoners. A lot of political prisoners that were in the gulags. Remember, we studied these political prisons, the gulags. A lot of these were released with the rise of Nikita Khrushchev's government, and he emphasizes the possibility of having peaceful coexistence. The idea that there are two economic systems, but they don't, even though they're not compatible, they can coexist. They're not going to win each other over, but they can exist in the same world without having to go into this conflict with each other. And so this change in Soviet doctrine, right, led to more cooperation, and it kind of left the door open for more liberalization in the Soviet Union, but also eventually for cooperation when it came to talking about limiting weapons later on in the 1970s with the strategic arms limitation talks. So we also then begin to see, though, going into the 1950s, as countries want to become more free of communism, the Soviet Union is also going to begin to kind of crack down on those countries. And we're going to look at those in the later sections. So that's kind of, I know this was a long section and this is the longest of the sections you'll have in this chapter, but, that's kind of what starts the Cold War, these technological, military, space, and then ideological differences between the US and the Soviet Union, and really trying to compete and trying to convince the people in their own sphere that the other is wrong, it's corrupt. When Nikita Khrushchev went to Disneyland, he was rejected, out of security concerns that they couldn't keep him safe. There's little things that took place like that. There was little incidences where when he came to the United States, he said, you may be better now, you may have more technology, but eventually we'll catch up and we'll crush you. And he's talking about economic production, but the newspaper headline said, Nikita Khrushchev says, we will crush you, right? So that kind of amplifies the fear and the rhetoric of anti-communist sentiments here in the United States. So in the next section, when you get ready to look at it, you're going to look at the challenges that the Soviets and the US face as they try to implement their control. And so we're going to look at how the Cold War actually played out throughout the world and how it influences places like Yugoslavia or Hungary, Czechoslovakia, China, etc. Okay, so that's it for this section. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you with the next lecture.